Good morning and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's such a pleasure to invite you to this very important conference, Disrupting Defense, Dynamic Security in the Age of Technologies, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it really does underscore the innovative, future-oriented work across the Atlantic Council, and in particular, the work of our Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. It's wonderful to have General Scowcroft himself here today, the chairman of our International Advisory Board, for whom we've named the center. And I really want to tip my hat to Barry Pavel, who's put together really an incredible center, and his entire team, and today particularly Alex Ward, who's worked so closely with Barry in standing up this conference. We developed this with a clear purpose to help the United States, along with allies and partners, figure out how to navigate, harness, and leverage global change to their advantage. We already see today how these changes are shaping and disrupting our world. For example, individual empowerment, we've talked a lot about, led to uprisings in Tahrir Square and Maidan, which led to Arab awakening and current events in Ukraine. The rise of global middle class, we're seeing with ripples all over the place from China to Venezuela. The diffusion of power from states to super-empowered individuals and non-state actors have placed new actors like Edward Snowden, Al-Qaeda on the same playing field in the Westphalian system as nation states, leading to our Westphalian plus world. If Assad in Syria and Putin in Russia have shown us anything, it's that the old world that we're accustomed to is not necessarily going away, but this new world is being superimposed upon it. And in many cases, some of these players in the old world are using new world strategies to position themselves. And we'll talk some about that. New technologies, 3D printing, 4D printing, biotechnologies, robotics, advanced algorithms, unmanned aircraft are changing the way we live. And they're also changing today's conference. So during the break, you can go to the boardroom just beyond this room where we'll have a demonstration of drones. They'll be flying around that boardroom, and 3D printing. And we thank the Coast Guard for the 3D printing, which is for MakerBot. And then Mark Rubin of Pop Motion has brought a few of his own personal drones for us to play with and be photographed next to. Some places you can get photographed next to, a cutout of some famous politician. Here you can get it next to a drone. The crisis in Ukraine is proving a critical case study for what the future of conflict could look like, but it's going to be very different in different situations. We've had some conversations here where one's even talking about whether we're seeing a new Russian military doctrine. Certainly, the incursion in Ukraine shows that old geopolitical paradigms no longer hold. Using unconventional methods, special ops, psychological operations, information operations, Putin has effectively seized control of Crimea and moving on to the eastern part of a once sovereign state. An effective response from the West, therefore, to these sorts of things can't include the normal conventional measures. With this new security landscape in mind, we've decided to build this effort on the successes of the Brent Scowcroft Center's two of their core initiatives. First, our Strategic Foresight Initiative, which looks out into the world of 2030 and beyond to visualize, plan, and strategize for the coming operating environment. Second, our emerging defense challenges practice, which thanks to the generosity of George London, and we're delighted to see the vice chair of the Scowcroft Center, George, here today, focuses on the security challenges and opportunities facing the Atlantic community and the world that arise at the interface of defense ministries and industries. It also looks at strategy making, providing constructive solutions in dealing for this world through both of these. We're very grateful to our strategic partners for this conference. Northrop Grumman believes in this endeavor as much as we do. We've joined forces in exploring and addressing these problems. Further underscores Northrop's impressive engagement in these crucial issues facing our nation and the world, particularly regarding the future and how to shape the future. I want to thank Stan Szymborski for the work that we've been able to do with Northrop. We have a great lineup for you today that will dig deep into these questions. I'll turn over very soon to General Scowcroft, who will introduce General Martin Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who will provide keynote remarks on planning for a dynamic world, where he will discuss how the military should plan for the coming environment. General Dempsey, it's such a great honor for us to have you with us here today. Thank you. We were one of the earliest venues for you when you took over your position. And if you look at the Q&A from 2.5 years ago, I think it was December 9th, you'll see an incredible Q&A with David Ignatius. It was really fantastic, well worth going back and reading it. You may also see a vocal performance of Christmas in Killarney. General Dempsey hasn't revealed what he might perform at the end of today's session. But in any case, as I said, also visit our boardroom during one of the breaks, and feel free to go to the operators and ask them any questions you'd like about either the printer or the drone. And please don't forget to tweet during the conference with the hashtag #ACDisrupt. I was a little bit nervous, Barry, about a hashtag called ACDisrupt, questioning how employees might handle that. Also tweet for the Scowcroft Center's new Twitter handle at @ACScowcroft. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor to General Scowcroft. General Scowcroft is very critical of how we introduce introducers at the Atlantic Council. So I'll be very brief, only to say he's one of the great public servants of our generation, or all of our generations, and two-time National Security Advisor. But beyond that, for the last 4 decades, his wisdom, all presidents have turned to over this period of time, and certainly the Atlantic Council and I have done so as well. General Scowcroft, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for that warm introduction and for inviting me here to introduce a proven leader, an outstanding soldier, an excellent tenor. That was a hidden talent. Fellow West Point alumnus and an overall good guy, General Martin Dempsey, the 18th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This conference is about how the United States and its allies should plan for defense and security in a world of individual empowerment, diffusion of power, new technologies, and other trends. You know, we're coming out of a tidy period in our world, and that is the world of the Cold War. It was tidy because the strategy was a given. It was put our arms around the Soviet Union and hold it until it changed. We had a lot of arguments about tactics, but we could always go back to the strategy and say, here's what we need to do, and everybody agreed. Suddenly, the Cold War is over, and globalization has come in and changed the whole basics of the world. And so we're in a period now that is new in 2 respects. Our strategy needs to be different, and the world itself is beset by forces which are fundamentally different and fundamentally new for us to work with. So this conference is about how the United States and its allies should plan for defense and security in this very, very different world, with a whole bunch of different things impinging on it. It's not just the Cold War. It's not just how you deal with the Soviet Union. It's how you cope with a world whose forces are different from what we've ever seen. I think it underscores the Scowcroft Center's burgeoning work on defense strategy. It's also a part of the Center's emerging defense challenges, work on foreseeing and planning for defense challenges based on these new global change. In my view, it comes at an important time for the transatlantic community and the world. Many of the challenges we expected to come at us further into the future are already happening today in different forms and in different places, surprising us just a bit, like Ukraine and the Arab world. The U.S. government and the Department of Defense are now thinking through how to deal with these issues and this world to prepare the United States to harness the forces at work and to take advantage of them in moving our strategy and our interests forward. Accordingly, we are very fortunate this morning to have Marty Dempsey to kick this conference off. As President Barack Obama's top military advisor and one of the leading figures in defining the path for and ensuring U.S. national security, there is no one more suited to tackling these complex challenges and outline the administration's current thinking on these and other kinds of issues. Marty has a long history of dealing with complex and challenging issues. Before being appointed and confirmed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey was the 37th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. From 2008 to 2011, he commanded U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, one of those key institutions whose task is to help the Army look to the future and try to understand and profit by it. From August 2007 to October 2008, he was the acting commander of U.S. Central Command. In previous tours, he commanded the 1st Armored Division in Baghdad and later led the Multinational Security Transition Command, Iraq. General Dempsey, it's an honor to have you with us today, and I want to thank you for all that you do and have already done in service to our country. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
General Scowcroft and Fred, it's good to be back. This is, I think this is my 3rd time here, but I also, in between those visits to your facility, as some of you know, I often invite members over. About once a month I have a seminar, and I call it my personal campaign of learning, and I'll bring folks over from parts of our nation that perhaps I don't know as much about or would like to know more about, and you've been kind enough to do that on several occasions. This time with you today is actually quite timely for me personally. I just came back from Afghanistan, and as you know, we're on the verge of a decision about our enduring presence as part of the NATO Resolute Support Mission. And as it won't surprise you to know, that decision is one that has to account for NATO's great contribution over the last 13 years. In other words, NATO has to come out of it, not just the United States, but NATO has to come out of it feeling as though the contribution was meaningful and will be enduring. This week I've got my Chinese counterpart here. I'll meet him this evening at National Defense University, a wonderful setting to greet him. And then tomorrow we'll spend the day together. Next week I go to Brussels to meet with my NATO Chiefs of Defense counterpart, and the week after that to Shangri-La, with a stop in the Emirates on the way and a stop in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on the way back. So this event today is kind of sandwiched, if you will, inside of some pretty important moments for me as chairman. Just to establish the expectations, I'm not going to sing today. So if you're here for that, I'll give you a moment to depart the room. Although if I were going to sing today, after that introduction from General Scowcroft, it would probably be Sinatra's My Way. Although I will say that the longer I'm in this job, it feels like I should sing a different kind of song, maybe something like, I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was. That, by the way, is a country western song. If you've never gone to YouTube, it's worth looking at. This day in history, in 1955, the Soviet Union and 7 communist bloc countries signed the Warsaw Pact. You can't make it up. I mean, you can't make up the fact that these days in history actually become quite meaningful as you look back at them. And those countries, of course, were Albania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, the German Democratic Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. And you recall those days. I don't recall them all that well. I was 3 years old. But I recall the aftermath and what it did to us as a nation and a military to have this standoff, if you will, and that which we now call the Cold War. 20 years later, actually, so 1975 is when I reported to my first unit in the United States Army, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And my responsibility was to patrol the Czech border on behalf of NATO and look across and see, to the extent we could in those days, what the Warsaw Pact was up to. Interestingly, in one of my first conversations with my Russian counterpart, as the Ukraine crisis evolved, in that conversation, I said, his name is Valery Gerasimov, I said, Valery, you're not suggesting here that we should end our careers the way we began it. And we shared a light moment, but a profound moment, because those days in 1975, although frankly they were a lot clearer if you were a serving military officer, your responsibilities were much clearer, and the way, as the general described, the way you actually built the force and organized it, trained it, equipped it, and prepared doctrine for its employment was actually a lot clearer then than it is today. I'm not pining to go back to that kind of clarity, but it is interesting as I look at my career now 40 years in and compare it to how I started it. 15 years after that, 1989 to 1981, the Cold War was ending. I deployed to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And we saw what I think was the culmination of about 20 years of effort to create a military that could, with remarkable skill and success, deal with state-on-state conflict. And we did, as you well know. And then 15 years after that, I found myself in Baghdad, 2003, 2004, commanding one of those armored divisions that had been in Desert Storm, but now the responsibilities were far different. The responsibilities getting from the Kuwait border to Baghdad were quite similar. It was something we understood. But I recall when we got to Baghdad, General John Abizaid met me, and I said, okay, what do you want me to do now, boss, now that we're here? And he said, I want you to establish a safe and secure environment in Baghdad. And I said, I don't have any idea what that means, General. And he said, I know you don't, neither do I, but we'll figure it out together. And figure it out we did. And that exquisite Cold War tank division eventually adapted to become capable of literally seeking to provide safety and security to a city of, at that time, 7 million, with all of the underlying tensions that became manifest pretty quickly. So when I talk, and here we are, we're not yet 15 years hence, but we're 13 years beyond those days, beyond 2001. And when I talk about security today, I describe it, it's a little mnemonic device I use for myself, but I'll share it with you, 2, 2, 2, and 1, and I've spoken about this recently. Most of the time, people don't give you time to actually answer a question about strategy, to be honest. And so you end up trying to find a way to leave an impression about strategy. And that's why I've come up with this 2, 2, 2, and 1. 2 heavyweights, the world in which we live and the security with which we seek and the actions which we conduct are always conducted strategically in the context of what it will mean to the 2 heavyweights, or what effect it will have on the 2 heavyweights, and that is Russia and China. Then there's two middleweights, Iran and North Korea. And then there's two networks, the Al-Qaeda network, which we can speak about if you'd like, but which is Al-Qaeda and affiliates that stretch from Afghanistan, Pakistan, across the Arab Peninsula, certainly in eastern Syria, western Iraq, Yemen, over into Somalia, across North Africa, and into West Africa, all the way to Nigeria. And it's a network, and it doesn't mean that that network is one single coherent, ideologically linked or financially linked organization, but they syndicate themselves when it works to their convenience, and so we have to think of it as a network. And frankly, that network is a generational challenge, which is to say 20 or 30 years, and I'll come back to that. The other network, by the way, that doesn't get as much prominence as I believe it deserves is the transnational organized criminal network that runs north and south in our own hemisphere. And again, it's a network. We tend to think of that as a drug trafficking network, but it's equally capable and often found to be trafficking with, illegal immigrants, arms, laundering money. It's extraordinarily capable. It's extraordinarily wealthy. And it can move anything. It'll go to the highest bidder. And so that network deserves more attention, not just because of the effect it has on the social fabric of our country, but because of the effect it could have and is having, in my view, on the security of this nation. So that's the second network. So now 222, and the one is cyber. And General Scowcroft touched on cyber briefly. There's two issues that concern me with cyber. One is our lack of preparedness as a nation for a cyber attack. We have sectors within our nation that are more ready than others, but we don't have a coherent cyber strategy as a nation. And I understand why. There are some big issues involved with achieving that kind of coherence, issues related to privacy and cost, information sharing, and all of the liabilities that come in the absence of legislation to incentivize information sharing. We got some heavy lifting to do yet. We have made some significant progress in our department at protecting our network and developing tools to conduct cyber operations externally. We've empowered combatant commanders to protect their networks much more effectively. We've got a long way to go. And the other thing that concerns me about cyber is not just the denial or the destruction of entire networks, which clearly would be a problem in the financial sector or could be in critical infrastructure, but I worry equally about the corruption of data. I have a PowerPoint slide that I keep on my desk to remind me each day that I need to think about cyber every day. And that slide, by the way, is a picture of a dashboard of a car. And on the dashboard, you can see that the car is in park, but the speedometer is reading 120 miles an hour. And that's possible. It's not possible. It's a fact. That corruption of the data in a car's computer is possible and can be accessed through the network in which the car lives, OnStar or whatever it happens to be. So those kind of, the corruption of data from a military perspective is actually more alarming than the denial of data, because denial of data you work around, but corruption of data causes you to lose confidence in your systems. And our entire, we've become a very technologically savvy and in many ways dependent military organization, and we rely on three things that the Air Force officers in the audience will be familiar with: precision, navigation, and time. And so all of our systems rely upon that, and to the extent that we maintain confidence in the data that's presented to us, we'll be more or less effective. So we got a 2, 2, 2, and 1. If your next cocktail party and somebody says, "What do you think?" 2, 2, 2, and 1. Just as simple as that. So now what we've got to do in the face of those security issues is understand that they each require a different approach. You can't. You deter nation states, you use the instruments of power, all of them, diplomatic, economic, and military, differently, whether you're dealing with a nation state, whether you're dealing with a middleweight power who aspires to have more influence than it warrants and who can go rogue from time to time. And certainly networks are not responsive to the kind of pressure that nation states are. And so I think what you're seeing in the world that General Scowcroft described is an effort to to determine how best to apply, in my case, the military instrument of power against adversaries and potential adversaries, each of whom respond differently to different kind of pressures. Our joint force is agile, it's adaptable. Some of you have heard me testify, it embraces change. It's actually eager for change. It may not always seem that way, but it is. But what it isn't eager to accept is uncertainty, and we've got a little bit too much uncertainty in our budget condition right now. Not a little bit too much uncertainty. We've got significant uncertainty. But nevertheless, we're becoming. There's two words that you've probably seen in our documents, whether it's the Strategic Defense Guidance or the QDR or the Chairman's Risk Assessment, which is an annual document. But the two words are agility and innovation, and we're challenging ourselves to see just how agile we are. And if we're not as agile as we need to be, what are we going to do about it? In fact, the Secretary of Defense convened an offsite, if you will. It happened to be at National Defense University, and brought in the combatant commanders last week. And we literally spent the entire day challenging ourselves on the issue of agility. And we're going to do the same thing soon on the issue of innovation, and then we'll see where those seminars take us. So let me end where I began, which is NATO. As I mentioned, we'll go next week to the NATO CHODS conference, as we call it, and that's a lead up to the summit in Wales in September. But NATO is at a critical crossroads, if you will, given the aggressiveness of Russia. So its eastern flank must be reconsidered. But I'll also tell you that my personal advice to my fellow CHODs in NATO is that the southern flank of NATO deserves far more attention than it currently receives from NATO. Essentially, NATO leaves the southern flank to the southern nations, to the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Italians, and the Greeks. And yet, the issues that are emanating into the NATO southern flank from the Middle East and North Africa could quite profoundly change life inside of Europe, not only Southern Europe, but well into Central and Northern Europe. So that's the conversation I'll be having with my NATO counterparts, and that's my opening remarks and a glimpse into what keeps me up at night these days. Thanks very much. You know, these are pub table chairs, and normally when I sit at a pub chair, something happens other than an interview.
Could someone deliver the Guinness? Thanks for that, and that was a terrific introductory remarks. Terrific to have you back here again. You mentioned at the end what keeps me late at night. I look at this, borrowing from your country tune choice, as the help us make it through the night part of it, which is my favorite country tune. Let's start with a little bit of applied science. You said in an interview, I think just this week, maybe with Defense One, you talked about the spread of technology among other factors and said the result has been a weakened international order, how difficult it is to take strengthness against weakness, et cetera, et cetera. You said it's harder to articulate the proper use of military power in that environment. It means you have to rebalance the instrument of the military. Talk about that perhaps, and look specifically at the Ukraine situation, but you can also apply it more broadly if you'd like, where you're seeing a situation where we're not addressing it necessarily, where we're addressing a potential military situation with economic weaponry in a way I'm not sure we ever have before. And on the other hand, we're facing a situation where Russia's also using new military tools that aren't of a conventional nature. So I'm interested in the science that you were talking about here, the weakened international order as you see it, but also the applied science in the case of Ukraine.
Well, just to be clear, the military instrument vis-a-vis Ukraine is really through Russia. So militarily, the issue in Eastern Europe needs to be about NATO. I mean, it's NATO that is the NATO alliance, which should be and is the most concerned. And so our efforts militarily in Eastern Europe have been to reassure our allies that our Article 5 responsibilities are clear to us. In terms of the use of the different instruments of power, I alluded to it there. Each of those actors, the two heavyweights, the two middleweights, the two networks, and the domain, they just respond differently to each instrument. And you and I had a conversation before we came in. You opined that we were using, and the general did, that we were using the economic instrument of power differently today. And one of the things I think about,
almost as a deterrent for military action rather than as punishment for acts already committed.
Yeah,
so,
or both.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me about that is because the military instrument has been pretty dominant over the past, the period I talked about, over the past 40 years in issues related to security. And so that we have a pretty clear idea, that is the military, when asked, what will the effect of this use of military power be? We actually can come pretty close to answering the question, notwithstanding the fact that once you begin to use it, it's a human, the human dimension kicks in and there's always surprise. But I actually brought in a bunch of, I brought in some economists to visit with me, and I asked them how they assess risk in the application of the economic instrument of power. And frankly, they were lost for an answer. It just wasn't a question, I think, that that had occurred to them to ask. Of course, we deal in risk constantly, and so we've developed over the course of time a fairly effective paradigm for assessing risk and articulating it. And so, in this new world that the general described, and by the way, he as you know, General Scowcroft coined the phrase, this new world order, in the early 90s. In this even newer world now, I think each instrument has to reassess its effectiveness and its risk if we intend to apply them differently. And they have to be applied differently against the actors I've described.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It essentially means if one's going to use the economy as a weapon, one has to understand the collateral damage and other impacts that would spin off of that. And the way one's done with military action for a long time, I think is that what you're arguing?
And like I said, I'm reacting to a group of economists who I asked to describe for me how they measure risk, and it didn't seem to me they had a very persuasive answer.
On the question of Ukraine, let me come also to something else that you've said that I found quite interesting, where you talk about how this is one of the most difficult things in general in your job is assessing risk. And you were talking about how risk is a combination of capabilities and intent. If you're looking at the intent of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine right now, how risky is the situation from your standpoint?
Well, that's where, we have a very clear picture of the capability of the Russian armed forces, at least the overt military forces of Russia. But intent is and will remain elusive. And I say that because it's, the activities of Russia and Ukraine could be the aggregate of Putin, the armed forces of Russia, looking to reestablish its bona fides, regionally. And it could very well be large portions of the Russian population eager to right the wrongs of the early part of the last decade of the 20th century. And the way we address this really depends upon where we find ourselves assessing that intent. To this point, I think it's largely driven, my personal judgment is it's largely driven by Putin, and a close circle around him. But that might actually make it more dangerous, not less dangerous. Because? Well, because as I heard it described, and if we polled this room and asked somebody to describe Vladimir Putin, we'd probably get more than one or two answers. But the most persuasive description I've heard is that he's driven by his desire for a personal legacy and the economic well-being of Russia, because he understands that his popularity is largely dependent on the economic well-being of, which goes back to the point, if we're going to use the economic instrument, if that's what motivates him, and if we're going to use the economic instrument, then our calculation of risk has to adjust.
Thank you, General. The other issue that you've talked about recently, which I also find fascinating, is this element of time, and you mentioned it a little bit in your opening comments. And you mentioned it in connection with the Syria situation, but I'll also ask a broader question as well. You said we're trying to understand and engage the element of time in the Syrian crisis, and you referred to the different words in Greek for time, including the term for right time. Can you talk about that in terms of the Syria crisis? There's some people who have said, well, the time to get more actively engaged was the early stages. There are other people who say there is no right time to get engaged, don't get engaged. So talk about the element of time in there, but also in general, with the world moving so fast and with the risks you're looking at so broad and hard to measure, how do you feel the sense of urgency in how we have to respond this time? Is there, we sometimes at Atlantic Council talk about this as a historic inflection point where we have to act right now to shape this moment or we'll miss our opportunity. But how much urgency, first of all, do you agree, but how much urgency is there behind it? So from Syria to the more general question of time.
Well, again, back to the effort to think our way into the future. I've actually taken a couple of ideas that I've gotten from authors, prominent authors, historians, and social scientists, and tried to knit them together. So there's you probably know Moises Naim's book, The End of Power. I met with him. There's a guy named Doug Rushkoff, who wrote a book called Present Shock. And it's in that book where this issue of time manifests itself. And basically what he says is that, we've been seduced by the idea that the more options you have, the better off you are. But what he posits in the book is that can actually be paralyzing. That the more options you have, actually, the more difficult it is to make a decision. He actually uses, for the record, in case my wife is watching, I've never speed dated, but he uses the example of speed dating, where if there's 20 potential partners in the room, you're probably walking out without a date. But if there's 6, you're probably going to get a date because you're kind of overwhelmed by the options, and it tends to paralyze you. And so I took that idea of how to think about time, and I matched it with Moises Naim's thesis in The End of Power, which is that most of the order that has heretofore provided our sense of order and well-being is diffused. The structures, he talks about the church, whatever church, that the power of the center is diffused. The economic corporations, it's all this, everything is moving to the edge, and you can see and hear and listen to the edge or the street because, there it is, right? We're tweeting about this conference, so, you got this constant, if you have a BlackBerry and it buzzes, you're dying to know what's on there, aren't you, really? You'll be polite enough probably not to look right now, but you're dying to know what's coming in on your BlackBerry. And so you've got this pervasive weakness, and you've got this overwhelming number of options, and it can be quite paralyzing. The answer, I think, is, this goes back to probably, General, when you were the National Security Advisor. We talked for many, many, many years about we really need to prioritize our interests. We got to prioritize our interests. We got to prioritize it. But we really never had to prioritize our interests because we had the capability and the capacity, and the number of threats to our interests were actually quite finite. There's nothing finite. I kind of simplified it by saying 2, and 1. But, look, we're trying to do our best to help the Nigerians get these schoolgirls back, which is part of that network, by the way, that I described. So the threats are proliferate, if you will. The options are equally proliferate. Weakness is pervasive. And that's a combination in which national security hasn't had to navigate for some time. And I don't have the answer, by the way. But you know what they say about education, they say, I just gave a commencement speech, I remember this. But education is when you stop asking the questions and start questioning the answers, or, you know.
So specifically on Syria, time is on our side, or what do you mean by the
It
element
can
of
be.
time in the Syrian crisis?
It can be, but I think time is a more important factor in decision making than it ever has been. And I'm not sure, as I try to provide my advice to the SecDef, the National Security Council, and the President, there is always an element of time in there.
I want to get to a couple of questions, but let me ask you one question that really fits with the whole theme of what we're doing here today. You have talked, in fact, in your risk assessment for the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, you wrote the following: my greatest concern is that we will not innovate quickly enough or deeply enough to be prepared for the future, for the world we will face 2 decades from now. True risk is that we will fail to achieve far-reaching changes to our force, our plans, our posture, our objectives, our concepts of warfare. Innovation is the military imperative and the leadership opportunity of this generation. So that's your analysis. 2 questions. What did the QDR do, or should it have done more to address this issue? And what are we doing to address this issue? And why is this so central to your concerns?
The QDR has been, this is going to shock many of you, the QDR was criticized. I could probably stop there. But the QDR was criticized for accounting for the fiscal environment in which we prepared it. You know, the legislation does require an unconstrained strategic assessment. The problem, of course, is that we also have the fiscal environment codified in law called the Budget Control Act. So, you know, it's a little bit unfair, frankly, to be bludgeoned on one hand for finding yourself fiscally constrained, and on the other for not accounting for the law which fiscally constrains you. That's a little bit unfair, it seems to me. That said, I feel better now. That said, I found that the approach we took into QDR to be prudent and responsible, and what it did is it illuminated it illuminated the imperative of rebalancing ourselves. That's not a word that we chose lightly, and it's been overused, maybe overburdened. You know, rebalance to the Pacific, rebalance the budget, rebalance the way we fight the way we fight. But it is the right terminology. We don't need to make, it seems to me, we don't need to make disruptive changes. Mm-hmm. I really don't think we do. But we do need to unpack the words agility and innovation. And we do need to account for the likely fiscal future and to get on with it in things like paid compensation, health care, retiring weapons systems, shedding excess infrastructure. You know, it used to be, again, back to when the general was the national security advisor, and we confronted ideas like BRAC, and we confronted changes in paid compensation, health care, weapons systems. There was enough slack in the system that, you know, you could find yourself, you know, achieving the 70% solution, and you could be quite content that the 70% solution would be adequate to the task of providing what the nation needs. But the slack the slack is pretty much out of the system, and so we've really got to get this right now. I mean, and by the way, the chiefs often remind ourselves, the Joint Chiefs, this is not a crisis today. It feels like it, but we're really not at that point yet. But if we ignore these changes that we need to make, whether it's in, you know, finding our way to achieve affordable manpower costs, shedding weapon systems that we no longer need, reducing excess infrastructure, becoming more innovative, in particular in the way we match requirements to procurement, and being more agile about the way we deploy the force. We actually are coining a phrase called dynamic presence, different perhaps than what we might call sustained presence. You know, right now, if we generate a carrier, we send it to CENTCOM, when it's done over there. When its shot clock runs out, it comes back. That's great if you're a combatant commander because you got a little predictability in how the force is applied in your AOR, but it's not so good globally, where you'd really want to be a little less predictable, a little more, and in your unpredictability, have a different effect on your potential adversaries and more opportunities to assure your allies. But that's an issue of agility. We can make those changes, but we can't wait. We can't do this 1 year at a time. Mm-hmm. And we're on a path to do it 1 year at a time. That's my concern.
And that's partly a product of the way the budget sequestration, all of that has kicked in.
It is.
The 1 year at a
yeah.
time.
And look, I'm not, look, I said in that article, I said, the two hardest words are risk and readiness. Mm-hmm. Readiness has no constituents. You know what I mean? Weapon systems have constituents. Bases have constituents. But readiness has no constituents, except those who have to apply the military instrument when the time comes. Really hard to articulate eroding readiness, and it's hard to articulate risk because it's a little different in each service, and it's very different depending on whether you're talking about a heavyweight, a middleweight, a network, or a domain.
Thank you. Questions from the audience, please. Get to as many as I can. And please identify yourself.
Yes, General Randall Fort with Raytheon. A quick observation. If you want to understand risk, don't talk to economists. You should go to financial firms, investment bank, commercial banks. They measure risk quite exquisitely and in great detail, and they might be able to help you with that issue. Your mention of agility brought to mind an article that then DepSecDef Lynn wrote in Foreign Policy about 4 years ago, on cyber, where he noted that it took the Department of Defense roughly 80 months to do a generic average IT acquisition. 4 3/4 years, almost 3 Moore's Law cycles. So as you look at agility, how much are you going to be hostage to or victim of the defense acquisition process in order to get the tools and the technologies you're going to need to be able to actually enable that agility that you desire?
No, that's the right question. By the way, when we looked at agility at this offsite I mentioned, we looked at agility in decision making. We looked at agility in managing the force, and even within that, we looked at our agility in crisis situations versus our agility in routine day-to-day operations. And we actually concluded that we're doing pretty well in a couple of those, not so well in others. And a couple of the places where we're not doing well enough are in management, decision-making in day-to-day. When we're in a crisis, we spring into action. And we generally have the authorities we need, and off we go. It's actually in the day-to-day operations of trying to deter and assure and be prepared to defeat if necessary, where we're not as agile as we need to be, either in our decision-making or in our management of the force, and I would say the same thing about in our acquisition systems. When there's a crisis, for example, we need to get mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles to Iraq and Afghanistan. It happens rapidly, in the true sense of the word. When we talk about a platform 7 years in the future, it's not so rapid and it's not so effective.
On that, you talked also about dynamic presence, which fits together with this. We've been talking here at the Scowcroft Center, the Council, about dynamic security. And there we're saying, this post-World War II focus on stability as our sole strategic goal or our overriding strategic goal, in a way, has to go out the window because that's not the world we live in. It's a disruptive world. And so we have to do dynamic security that harnesses all the factors and changes. Does that fit together with what you're talking about? Does that seem to be in the concept?
No, it seems to me to absolutely fit together, but I'd like to stay in touch with you on that effort. But, back to when I said I reached out to economists, I reached out to them for a different purpose than I actually, this is kind of organized serendipity, as I've heard it described, bringing people in a room who have no business being in the same room and seeing what happens. And so I didn't bring them in to talk about the application of the economic instrument of power. I actually brought them in to talk about energy security and what would the impact of us becoming energy independent be on nations like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like China. But the conversation actually migrated because they were interested in understanding how we assess risk, because they were concerned that they didn't understand how to assess risk. So it's in that context that I make the comment that if we're going to use the instruments of power differently in the future, which we are, and we should, I think we have to recalculate our risk models.
Very interesting. We're talking about LNG instead of SS-20s, but
Yeah.
Please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Leandra Bernstein with RIA Novosti. I heard you quoted once saying the pulse of an Irishman ever beats quicker when war is the story and love is the theme. I'd like to ask you about the former.
Yeah.
First, what do you think is the best case and worst case scenario in dealing with Russia, taking into account the multiple sources of power that we have in that relationship? And then also, 2016 is coming up. What would you think about a general, not necessarily you, but a general becoming the President of the United States one more time?
I didn't even know he was running, for Christ's sake.
Within the Russia question, can you also deal, as you're answering that question, with what you're seeing in terms of Russian capabilities? We're hearing quite a bit that there's some surprise of how quickly the Russian military is modernized and developed.
Yeah, I don't, so let me answer the question about worst case, best case. I mean, really the only way to put a value judgment on best case, worst case is, what do we think, how should this come out? The way it should come out is we shouldn't find ourselves back in a Cold War with Russia. I mean, we actually have an equal number and maybe a greater number of issues on which we collaborate with them, cooperate often, but collaborate more often. Whether it's the future of the Arctic or counter-narcotics or counter-piracy or
Space.
Yeah, space. We're competitive, but we're collaborative at the same time. And I think that the best case would be we would continue to be able to find common ground where common ground exists, and notwithstanding the fact that we think their activities in Eastern European are extraordinarily unsettling. And you know why. I mean, there's ethnic enclaves scattered throughout Eastern Europe, and if one nation decides that it will deal with these things on its own terms, and including the use of military force, that is a serious step, and probably a step that does take us back more toward the Cold War than away from it. You asked
Capabilities.
Yeah, so
Special ops, information ops, the whole thing.
Yeah, my previous counterpart, a general named Makarov, came to me a couple of years ago and said, here's our plan to reform the Russian military. And they're on plan. It's smaller. They're trying to make it more professional. They're trying to increase its technological capabilities. They are putting more emphasis on their strategic forces than we are. And, at some point we'll have to decide if we have to change our approach based on theirs. But they're transparent. They're relatively transparent about it, as are the Chinese when I meet with them. Your question about should a general run for president? That is the worst case scenario, by the way. The worst case scenario with Russia? Oh, back to the Cold War, and and we've got to deploy forces into the Baltics and Poland, and because those nations feel themselves to be threatened. Yeah. You know what I've said about generals and flag officers, admirals and generals? If you want to get out of the military and run for office, I'm all for it. But don't get out of the military, and this is a bit controversial, I got it. Don't get out of the military and become a political figure by throwing your support behind a particular candidate. I find that look, if somebody asks me when I retire to support them in a political campaign, do you think they're asking Marty Dempsey or are they asking General Dempsey? I am a general for life, and I should remain true to our professional ethos, which is to be apolitical for life, unless I run. And if by the way, You heard Bob Gates.
You're not announcing it.
Yeah, no, I'm not announcing it. But I still have some laps to run in this race. But run, yes, and may the best man or woman win. But use the title to advocate a particular political position. No.
Thank you. Please, here, the woman in the back, right there.
Hi, I'm Patty Morrissey. I work for the National Intelligence Council, for the National Intelligence Manager for Military Issues. And we are working towards updating our unifying intelligence strategy to be more reflective and more consistent with understanding agility, innovation, what we need to support the military in this 21st century, very different environment. I was struck by your 2221. Because I would say 222125. And that's one of the things we're wrestling with is how do you do what we call global coverage? What do you need to know to be prepared for Nigeria, Libya, Syria as these things pop up? And as you do everything from maybe, remove chemical weapons to address a humanitarian crisis, how do you get the knowledge base from us that you need to be more agile?
That's such a super question, and I hope you'll grab on to one part of it as well, which is what does 2221 look like in 2030? So in other words, does that have to shift? Does that paradigm have to shift? But
yeah, it's really a profound question, particularly asked in the context of the fiscal environment in which we're navigating. Because there is this insatiable appetite, actually, for intelligence and information, and generally, my assessment, when I have conversations with Director Clapper and Director Brennan, I think the intelligence community does an exceptional job of providing the indications and warnings we need, but there's just no way to satiate that insatiable appetite. It's not possible. And in particular, given the what we see in terms of the defense budget. So, but I'll also then tie it back to what I said earlier about time and and the effect of information on time. I'm not suggesting that we should be content that we don't know everything, but I will suggest to you quite clearly that when we do know everything, we immediately feel some obligation to do something about it. And so I'm not asking you to do less. Let me put it this way. I'm not asking you to do more with less. I think you'll have to do less with less, but not less well. And that's going to take some serious thinking about where to prioritize.
And the paradigm 2221 is we look
Where is
out?
it? I think that's going to. I think that will stand the test of time for the predictable future.
Great, that's what I was wondering. Yeah. Let me take two last questions there. I think that's all we're going to have time for. So let's take those two in a row and then let you get to a final round of answers.
Hi, General. John Hudson with Foreign Policy Magazine. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your thinking has evolved on arming the Syrian rebels. Obviously, early on, you were on record in support of it, but it's a changing conflict, and things have changed a lot over the last few years. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Sure. Let me do it, and let me speak about it in these terms. When we look to the future and seek to determine how this will end, at some point, the Syrian opposition will need a few things. It will need a governance structure that can effectively provide good services and security to the population, or it'll quickly fail. Whoever it is will fail almost immediately. Secondly, they will need some force capable of holding ground, both for humanitarian purposes, as a platform for further activity against the regime, and by the way, for counter-terror activity as that threat continues to grow. And so, when I speak about what I think Syria needs, I describe it in those terms. They need a They need the force they have now, which is trying to protect local villages and try to harass the regime and level the playing field. They need something that eventually will be able to hold ground. And they need a counter-terror capability, all of which is responsive to Syrians. And we're not on a path currently to provide that. And so, you know, as we look to the future, I think that's the conversation we need to have. Not, by the way, not unilaterally. I mean, I think that's a conversation we need to have regionally, because this, by the way, this issue is not Syria. It's Beirut to Damascus to Baghdad.
But their argument, of course, is if I can't take care of the Air Force and what's hitting me on the ground, I can't do any of those things you say we should do.
Yeah, that is their argument. That's their argument.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which you don't necessarily agree with.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, look, if Assad took his family and all of his cronies and departed Syria today, how does that country, how does it articulate itself? I mean, I've heard it described as a succession of conflicts. You have the conflict that currently exists, then there'll be the second conflict, which is kind of an internal conflict, and then there'll be the third conflict against the terrorist organizations that are growing there. That's probably right. Yeah.
So, General Dempsey, I have several more questions, but I've promised you to get you out of here 9:35. You actually have a world of issues to take care of. You've talked about the travels that you're going to be on. We wish you good travels, safe travels, and thank you for your enormous service to our country and our alliance. Please, we're going to applaud General Dempsey in a second. Stay in your seats. We're moving on to the next panel, Disruptive Geopolitics, with Francis Rose moderating. So
is there any other kind?
But General Dempsey, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks.
Very polite. Thank you. No sign.
Thanks, General. Good to see you as always. Yeah.